now, after having had this excursion where you took us in the interwar period, we are going there once more with Sophie Spaan, if I pronounced this correctly,
yes.
in the University of Utrecht, creating an intellectual Muslim space in interwar Western Europe, the Lahori Ahmadiyya in Britain.
Well, I want to tell you something about my broader research and then specifically use the Lahori Ahmadiyya to kind of use them as an example. So I'm looking at Muslims in interwar Europe, and specifically Britain, Germany and France, because there are important religious centers there. Usually when I tell people I'm doing research about Muslims in interwar Europe, the first thing they say is, oh really, were there any? So yes, there were. This is not the end of my talk. Very different backgrounds, mainly already in the 19th century you had some communities in France and also for instance in Liverpool. But in the interwar period, they grew in numbers and there were more institutions. Mainly lots of migrant workers and also lots of students. So for instance, in this sense, Germany became a hub for political activism, sort of against France and Britain. And then, like it says on the slide, lots of different backgrounds and lots of different locations that people ended up in. So, my overall sort of research questions so far are how and to what extent did Muslims in interwar Europe express and experience their religious identity? And since identity is also the topic of this panel, identity is a very complicated thing. It's a very malleable concept and very fluid, and whichever one sort of card in your identity card deck takes priority over the other depends on the time and place. So it's not only religious identity, it's also composed of, gender, education, culture, regional identity, all these different things. Then secondly, how was their interaction with the European environment, and did these Muslims initiate a process of indigenization of Islam leading to a European Islam or European Islams? So although this is the Middle Eastern Studies conference, for one of the main aims of my project is to situate these Muslim communities in Europe within a European history. Then to make this a bit more concrete, so a few points of entry. First of them, institutionalization, because that is not only an expression of religious identity but also sustains it. Then secondly, Muslim publications in Europe at the time. There were many, and these are also important in becoming part of this sort of discourse, religious discourse. And then thirdly, conversion, and specifically sort of a post-World War I context, because there were quite a lot of converts that converted. Then, this is the Grande Mosquée de Paris, to show you a nice picture, which was inaugurated in 1926. When we're looking at institutions, mosques are an obvious point to start. But I wanted to talk about the Ahmadiyya, and specifically the Lahori Ahmadiyya. So the Ahmadiyya were a movement originated in India in the 19th century under the leadership of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. They were a very specifically missionary movement, so their goal was to convert people. They split into branches, the Lahori branch and the Qadiani branch, both of whom had missions in not only the UK but also in Germany, and they were planning to set up other missions around Europe. So this is the Wormersdorf Mosque in Berlin, which opened in 1925, was organized by the Lahori Ahmadiyya. And as you can see, this was an Eid party there, and very varied company, lots of different types of people, sort of bohemian Berlin of the 1920s attracted lots of interest. But I wanted to talk about the Shah Jahan Mosque in Woking, which was actually built in 1889, but ended up in disuse, not really used until 1912, when Kamaluddin ended up, an Ahmadiyya, a barrister, ended up in London and started publishing the Islamic Review, which later became the mosque's publication from his home in Kew. And he reopened the Shah Jahan Mosque. And this became quite an important cultural and debate sort of center. They also organized lectures at the London Muslim House and organized the Muslim Literary Society. So the Woking mission really became, in the interwar period, an important focal point for Muslims, and all over Britain came to this mosque. It's an example of it's in August 1915, during the war. But, yeah, it also attracted kind of sort of lots of middle, upper class British people who converted. So Lord Hadley is an example of this, who converted in 1913. And Marmaduke Pickthall, who did a famous translation of the Quran, you might know him through there. So, although the mission had a Lahori Ahmadiyya identity, their events and even their whole outlook was quite inclusive in the sense that people from different types of Islam came to join their organizations and events, and especially many of the converts didn't identify purely as Ahmadiyya, but mainly as Muslim. These institutions were also not necessarily really embassies, but almost used in a way that if an important person from the Islamic world came to Britain, they would go to the Moking Mosque. And this is an example of that. Other people were, for instance, the head of the Ismaili sect, or King Farouk of Egypt, and a man who's been in the news quite recently, Mufti Amin al-Husseini, also visited this mosque. Then moving on to publications, so this is an example. There were many already in the 19th century, these sort of publications to talk about religion and religious ideas and notions started to become very widespread in the Muslim world, and also in the interwar period. An example of that that's quite famous is Al-Manar from Cairo. But also in Europe there were a lot of different types of Muslim publications that were specifically aimed at a European market, or even broader than that, but they were published in Europe for Europeans and for European Muslims. So this is kind of an important way to solidify this presence was through these publications. You had in Berlin also the Muslimische Revue, which was from the Wilmersdorf Mosque, and there are many other examples of magazines, but limited time, so I'll focus on this one. Very interested in stimulating debate and in trying to get people to talk about different aspects of Islam. Of course, they were a missionary organization, so this had also an agenda, but very much wanting to stimulate review, stimulate debate. Other important topics that they were talking about were progress. They really presented Islam as a very modern, rational, progressive religion, and progress was an idea that was going on in many different areas of society and many different people. So in that sense, they really fit into this sort of environment of thinking about these specific themes. Then when we talk about converts, and they also talked a lot about World War I, really positioning themselves as new spiritual alternatives. Have you seen the second quote? After a great war, the world is waiting for another church, an after-war church, which already the concept of an after-war church I thought was quite interesting that they said it in that way. But they really presented Islam as the alternative, and that they observed in the first one that after the First World War, Europe, and then specifically Britain, is frantically trying to retrieve these moral foundations in Christian Science, revivalism, Mormonism, and spiritualism. So all these different religious alternatives, of which spiritualism indeed was one in the interwar period in Britain, mainly because of sort of its radical egalitarian ideas. And Islam was also attractive in a way because of this also sort of these principles of rationality and equality that kind of fit in with what a lot of people were looking for at the time. There were between 1913 and 1953 an estimate of 483 conversions through the Lahori Ahmadiyya. So that's, and then there's probably more outside of them, but they definitely converted the most. This is a picture of 3 soldiers who converted. There was an extra prestige, if, especially in this period, if it were soldiers who converted. So what I've sort of been saying about these spiritual alternatives, and Islam included, is almost to say that Christianity was losing ground in this period in Britain. So was this the case? Well, since the 1890s and the 1900s had seen a sort of high religiosity, most of the volunteers who went to war before conscription in 1916 were quite religious, also because the churches were kind of recruiting from the church community, and they were kind of very enthusiastic about the war and making it almost a battle between evil and good, and patriotism started to blend in a way with religion. So there was definitely this this idea, but then once it turned out, once after the war and already during, when the total destruction became clear, there was more criticism on the Church of England because they had been kind of not positive, but they had been enthusiastic about the war. So, and also a lot of chaplains who were sent to the front were seen as sort of cowards because they were not really participating in the fighting, and they weren't really able to comfort the soldiers, who often turned to something that was called trench religion. So kind of very more in a way like praying before going over the top or seeing visions, or more superstitious, and the clergy kind of looked down on this. So definitely among veterans there was less of a church attendance in the interwar years. It's a declaration of conversion. But and this is an article that a converted soldier, James Beach, wrote in the Islamic Review, which basically talks a lot about how, you know, horrible and horrendous the war was. But even though I'm not saying that the interwar years led to less religion or less Church of England and then more Islam. It's not as simple as that. It does seem that the interwar years reflected sort of an insurgence against the rigid structure of the church, and trying to get sort of a less hierarchical engagement with religion and more practical and egalitarian way of organizing religion. And this lack of priesthood in Islam was also one of the, you know, a big reason for people to convert to it. So lack of priesthood and sort of more emphasis on equality. More to say that in the interwar years in Britain there was a space for Islam because of these reasons. Small space maybe, but a space. So coming from all these things, a few initial short observations are for me that there are many. I've only talked about the Ahmadiyya today and in a very, very limited, limited amount of time. But there are many different ways in which Muslims engaged with their environment and expressed their religion. There were also problems with sectarianism, which I will not go into now. But in any case, in Europe there was a huge variety of Muslims, and specifically Western Europe, and then a huge variety of how people expressed their religion, also depending on the location where they were. If you were a Muslim in a suburb in France, you're a very different Muslim from someone in London, automatically due to national differences. But then there were also transnational networks, of which the Ahmadiyya are an example. Although they dealt with different circumstances, specifically if you think about the 1930s Berlin, the Nazis coming to power. Of course, it's a very different sort of situation than the Ahmadiyya community in Britain, but they did have a lot of connections and they visited each other, they wrote in each other's magazines. So these transnational networks were there. Then, thirdly, these publications and these debates and lectures and magazines really fit into this, organized by Muslims, really fit into this intellectual climate and trend of the time. The First World War had a great influence on religiosity, leading to a less hierarchical engagement with religion, which included a space for Islam. And then the Lahori Ahmadiyya were able to capitalize on this through the way that they presented and engaged people with Islam. And they're an example of many different groups who together, you could say, initiated or were starting to initiate a process of indigenation of Islams in Western Europe. So taking place through institutionalization, publications, and the many converts sort of as mediators in this whole project. Okay, I'm under the 15 minutes.
Thank you very much.